Our scripture lesson this morning is from John's Gospel, the 6th chapter. I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 15. After this, Jesus went across the Galilee Sea, that is, the Tiberias Sea. A large crowd followed him because they had seen the miraculous signs he had done among the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat there with his disciples. It was nearly time for Passover, the Jewish festival. Jesus looked up and saw the large crowd coming toward him. He asked Philip, "Where will we buy food to feed these people?" Jesus said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "More than half a year's salary worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to have even a little bit." One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "A youth here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that for a crowd like this?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass there. They sat down, and about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the bread. When he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, each getting as much as they wanted. When they had plenty to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that had been left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw that he had done a miraculous sign, they said, "This is truly the prophet who is coming into the world." Jesus understood that they were about to come and force him to be their king. So he took refuge again, alone, on a mountain. May God add his blessing to this reading of his holy word. Thanks be to God. You know, it's always difficult to preach a story like this one to church folks because it is a story with which we are all so familiar. We know this story, don't we? Well, we should know the story because it's the only story about Jesus that appears in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But because it does appear in all 4 Gospels, when we read it, we often read it through the lens of all 4 stories. We take bits and pieces from this version and add it to this version, and pieces from over here and add it to this one, and we kind of blend the story all together in our minds to be one story. But overall, we have a pretty good idea of what the story is all about. But I think it is important to realize that the writer John in this passage is not so much interested in chronology or the details, if you will, as he is in theology. He's not telling the story to relay to us the historical facts of what happened once upon a time long ago and far, far away. So I don't want us to get hung up in the fact that the details vary somewhat from the telling in Matthew and Mark and Luke. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying here that what John says happened really didn't happen, because I believe there had to have been some kind of wondrous event that took place that day, because word of that event spread far and wide over a long period of time. You remember that when John actually wrote his gospel, it was at least 100 years after this picnic on the mountain took place. But what I want you to hear, what I think is important for us to realize, is that John tells the story in his peculiar way, in the way John tells it, because he is trying to say something to us about who Jesus is. It's not about the details and about whether or not he got it exactly the same way as Matthew and Mark had told the story. What John is trying to do is to teach us about Jesus, who this Jesus, this Messiah, is. He is showing us the signs, if you will. And as he does so, he is also telling us some important things about who God is and who we are in relationship to God. John not only gives us windows into the glory of God, but also I think he gives us windows into our own shallowness of faith, if you will. John's readers and hearers would have quickly picked up on the parallels, I think, that day that he was drawing between Jesus and Moses. You remember Moses, right? The great Old Testament prophet. John, in this passage, I think, is trying to present Jesus as a new prophet. The man of God who will now usher God's people into a new kingdom, a new land, a new way, much like Moses had done all those years before. So John sets the scene and sets this story in the time of Passover. And I think that's very intentional. He's trying to get us to see Jesus as this new Moses, this new prophet, this new leader of God's people. And John is aware of the people's hunger. Jesus is aware of the people's hunger just as Moses was regarding those who he was leading out of slavery in Egypt. Again, you have to kind of go back to the story. Remember, Moses led the people of Israel out of captivity in Egypt. He led them out into the wilderness where they wandered for 40 years. And much of the time, their complaint was that of hunger. And God, through Moses, provided for the people in their time of need. God gave them manna, as the Old Testament called it, and the people were filled. So again, I want you to see the parallel that John is painting between Jesus, the new prophet, the new leader of God's people, and Moses, the one who had led them so long ago. I think this is important to what John is trying to teach us. But the parallels don't stop there. To summarize, Jesus is the new lawgiver, the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus is giving the people a new Passover. Again, I told you, this is said at the time of the Passover in John's Gospel. A new Passover, a new freedom from slavery, and a new family meal to remember it by. And Jesus is going to feed us as we journey through the desert ourselves. Again, it's just kind of setting the table, if you will, this parallel between Jesus in John's Gospel and Moses in the Old Testament story of the Passover and the Exodus. Those who study these kinds of things, these theological things, point out that in John's Gospel, what we have here in the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is just not a story about feeding 5,000, but is in a real sense John's institution of the Lord's Supper, what we as Methodists typically celebrate every first Sunday. Because if you go back and listen to what he says, John says Jesus takes the bread the little boy had brought forward and gives thanks to God, and then he gives it to those there. And that's what we do in communion, isn't it? This story has a very strong Eucharistic undertone. This is no ordinary bread that Jesus is offering them on the hillside that day. Jesus is offering those gathered there the bread of life, which of course is Jesus himself. So that's just kind of setting, if you will, setting the table for where the story is coming from. One of the things I really think is important in the story is for us to notice is that Jesus doesn't just give them enough. The song we sang just a few moments ago talks about that. It's never just enough that God provides. Not just enough, but more than enough to satisfy. Enough for us, but also enough for everyone else. 12 baskets left over, John tells us. Maybe not literally, but figuratively. That is enough for all the people of the world. You see what John's telling us? John is telling us that Jesus is the Messiah, God's anointed one, and he has come to bring all people into a new relationship with God. He is enough for everyone, for all of us, more than enough. With this picnic, this meal on the mountain, what we get here is a glimpse of God's heavenly banquet. And John is teaching us something else very important about body. God is teaching us John is teaching us that our God is a God not of scarcity, not of just enough, but of abundance. Our God is a God of more than enough. Our God pours out blessing upon blessing upon blessing on us. It's a matter of extravagant grace, and it's there for all of us, for each one of us, if we'll just let Jesus take the lead and show us how to receive it. If we do, we'll receive enough for us and for others as well. Jesus is the wondrous Son of God, a God of miracles, a God of abundance, a God of more than enough. You know, we claim that we believe in a God of miracles, do we not? And yet sometimes I wonder if we really believe that. Or are we perhaps sometimes more like the disciples in the story who didn't have that faith? Are we more like them than we are about the little boy who was willing to give what he had and trust? John says Jesus knew from the beginning what he was going to do. He knew that he would feed the people gathered that day. But he didn't let the disciples know that, did he? He put it out there. What are we going to do, Philip? How are we going to feed these people? He knew, but I think he wanted to hear what Philip had to say. And Philip couldn't see. He didn't know. He didn't believe. They'd seen all kinds of signs and wonders from Jesus in the weeks and the months leading up to this story. They knew the wondrous things that God had been doing in Jesus, but still, when the time came to believe, Jesus says, Philip, what are we going to do? And he says, I don't know, Jesus. A half year's salary wouldn't even be enough to give them but a bite each. What are we going to do? I think Jesus knew that Philip wasn't there yet, that he didn't quite yet see the possibilities that came with Jesus. He still doubted, I think, that God could and would work with Jesus. But you know, Philip's not much all that unlike you and I, is he? For many of us in the 21st century, we have trouble with this whole notion of miracles. It doesn't really fit with our postmodern concept of the world. Most of us have trouble believing that the laws of nature can be circumvented and the miraculous can happen. But you know, think about it this way. That wasn't an issue for the people in Jesus' day because the laws of nature, as we understand them, hadn't been invented yet. We certainly hadn't come to understand them. I don't think they got so hung up in the, can this really happen the way it does, the way we tend to? I think the people in Jesus' day, the hearers of John's gospel, those first hearers, understood that this was a story about what God could do, not the details about how you take 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and feed 5,000 people and have 12 baskets left over. I don't think they got hung up in the how can that happen. I think they just focused on what it was saying about the God they needed in Jesus. They didn't need to explain it, as Ricky used to say to Lucy in the old I Love Lucy series. They just accepted the story for what it was, the truth that it was teaching them. All they knew was that this little boy offered up meager rations, and somehow out of that 5 loaves and 2 fish, 5,000 plus were fed. How did it happen? I don't know. Maybe everybody there actually had food that they weren't willing to share, and when this one little boy stepped out in faith and offered his, others began to follow suit. I don't know. And I don't think it really matters, does it? Because basically what it's saying to us is that ours is a God of abundance. It's there. There is enough. There's more than enough if only we will trust. It's not up to us to worry about how it will all work out. The details, the mechanisms always. Sometimes all we need to do is to be that little boy and to step up in faith and offer what we have and trust God to work out the details. You see, Jesus, I think, was going to feed those people that day no matter what. He didn't say to his disciples, you think we should try to feed all those folks? It wasn't a question about if. It was, where are we going to get enough food? Philip said, sorry, Lord, it can't be done. Andrew went a little further. He did actually offer this little boy's lunch. But he knew it wasn't going to stretch far enough. I think if it had been up to Philip and Andrew, the whole mission would have just stopped right there. Sorry, Jesus, we did what we could, but you're not going to get enough food to feed all those folks. No way. But Jesus saw resources that the others didn't see. A little boy, one deemed about as worthless as a woman in his world, had something that in Jesus' hands could become more. Andrew had just missed it. But Jesus knew that with God's help, it was just what was needed. And it proved to be enough. It proved to be more than enough, didn't it? I think so often in the church, we see problems from a scarcity perspective. And yet, we have also seen time after time after time that what we think of as too little in God's hands becomes enough. Kevin, help me out here. Y'all do something pretty amazing at your church called Project 44 Farm, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And today I read that part of what y'all are doing is giving away 3 cars.
Ben started this ministry. He's an auto mechanic, and everybody, not everybody, let me rephrase that. People will donate cars to him, and he will put a certain amount of about $1,000 into fixing those cars. And there's an application process, and they will give those cars away. They will pay for the tax, title, and license, and pay for a couple months of insurance, and give these cars to people in need. For instance, there was a man in North Fort Worth who was walking 7 miles to work in the morning and 7 miles back in the day, and he just couldn't, that's what he did. And now he has a car, and so he can drive to and from. But in the 3 years or so that they have been doing this, they are presenting cars 95, 96, and 97 to people this morning at our church in Granbury. And it's all just because he got this idea in his head that, hey, this is what I do. This is the resources I have, so I'm going to start giving cars away to people in need. And people donate cars, he fixes them up and gives them away.
Perfect example of somebody saying, I don't have much, God, but this is what I have. This is what I can do. And we're almost up to 100 cars now.
Yes.
100 lives have been changed because Ben Fields had this idea that he could take what little he had and turn it over to God, and it would be not just enough, but more than enough.
And they have a farm and feed thousands every year as well, so they just decided to build a farm in Granbury, and it's there as well.
Was this also the Fields?
It is.
It was all part of their ministry?
Yep.
And Margaret's now, the wife is now on staff at Ashford, right?
Yes, and she has a counseling ministry.
Okay, yeah.
They are using what they have in abundance.
A wonderful story about how God can take what we may see as something small, and if we trust it, entrust it to God, it becomes not just enough, but more than enough. It becomes abundant in changing life. And who knows how many lives have been touched? Who knows how many people have been brought to Christ because of this idea that Ben Fields, a mechanic, a faithful Methodist layman, had to make a difference with the gifts God had given him. This story, I think, is about the fact that we all have something to give. We may not see it as being very much. We may not think that it's much at all. But if we take what we have and instead of holding it to ourselves for fear of not having enough ourselves, if we take what we have and offer it to God, then God will bless it and multiply it and use it so that others will be blessed by our abundance. What Ben and Margaret Fields and the church at Acton have done is a wonderful example of us having more than enough. You know, I'm as guilty as anyone of thinking, God, I just don't have enough. You know, I messed up my car last week. I don't know where I'm going to get the money to pay for that. I just don't have enough. But you know what? I am blessed beyond belief, as are each of you in this room. We live in a country of extravagant wealth. Even if we may not feel like it ourselves, we live in a world of extravagant wealth compared to most of the world. There are people in our community who do not have enough to eat, who do not have a car to get to work, people who want to do for themselves but can't. I think all God asks is for us to take what we have and to trust it to God and let God make a difference in the lives of those people in our community and beyond. For us, it may not seem like much. For us, it may not seem like enough, but with God, it is not only enough, it's more than enough. Our God is a God of abundance, a God of extravagant grace. If we give what we have and place it in Christ's holy hands, it will be more than enough. So I guess the question today is, what's in your lunchbox? The little boy had 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. It wasn't much, but when he gave it to Jesus, it became more than enough. When he said, "Dear Jesus, take it, use it as you will," it fed 5,000 plus with more left over. What's in your lunchbox? Do you have a talent that you could volunteer? Extra funds you could offer for a particular ministry? Is there something you're willing to do without so that others will come to know the wondrous grace of God that we know in Jesus Christ? Some of you may be familiar with the wonderful words of Nelson Mandela, one who was instrumental in helping fashion South Africa into a very different kind of country than it was just a few short years ago. Hear these words of Nelson Mandela. He says, "Our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate, but that we are powerful beyond measure." Our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate, but that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that frightens us, he says. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, handsome, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God, he says. Your playing small does not serve the Lord well. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born, he says, to manifest the glory of God within us. It is not just in some, he says, it is in everyone. And as we let our light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate, but that we are powerful beyond measure. A little boy who had been told by his world that he didn't amount to much had the courage to offer up what he did have. And people's lives were changed. Maybe you're not a great orator, but I bet you can tell somebody about your experience with God if you try. Maybe you don't have a lot of money, but you might be able to help fund a ministry that God has placed on your heart, much like Ben Fields did. Maybe you've never known yourself to be all that good at praying. Perhaps you could give it a try and maybe even ask others to join you in lifting up the needs of our church, our community, our world. Can you try? I know Meals on Wheels is always in need of someone to deliver food for those who can't care for themselves. Do you cook? Here in a couple of weeks, we're going to have an opportunity to once again provide lunch for the in-service day for the teachers at Paloma Lakes Elementary. I don't cook, but I can do at least enough, good enough, maybe more than enough, to help provide a meal for some hardworking teachers who don't get a lot of appreciation for what they do. Do you have an hour a week you can spare? I know the principal's already asking us if there are people who are willing to give an hour a week to mentor a child. There are children over here who don't have solid families that help them succeed in school. And you don't know, an hour a week of your time could help turn a life around. May not seem much to you, but when you turn it over to God, it's more than enough. Maybe you could give somebody a ride, or make a phone call, or drop a note to someone who hadn't been here for several weeks. Or maybe you have construction skills. You know, our kids have learned wonderfully how to build ramps over the last few summers. And here in a couple of weeks, we're going to have an opportunity to do that for someone in our own church family. You may not think you have much, but you do. Maybe there are other light household repairs you can offer yourself to do for those who can't do for themselves. Or maybe you can be on a committee, or maybe you can help us dream dreams as a church and think of that next new thing God is calling us to do. To you, you may not think you have much to offer, but you know what? When you place what you do have in Jesus' hands, it's enough. No, it's more than enough, isn't it? We serve a God of abundance. And when we offer ourselves, God will abundantly bless that which we offer to bless others. I think the living Christ will continue to change our lives and the lives of the people in this community if only we offer ourselves to His service. I hope that our response will not be like that of Philip or Andrew. You know, God, I don't have much. There's just no way I can do much with what I've got. May we be instead like that little boy who says, it's not much, but here it is, Lord. Take it, use it, bless it, and bless others too. Thanks be to God that we serve a God who is big enough. Thank you.